Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Demystifying Cyber Insurance webinar presented by Integrated Cyber. We're pleased to be joined today by our special guest, Kirsten Bay, the CEO and co-founder of Cysurance. I'd personally like to thank each of you for taking the time out of your day to educate yourself regarding cyber insurance. If you find this content helpful, which I'm sure you will, please share the information with your coworkers so they can listen to the rebroadcast that will be available at integrated-cyber.com. Finally, you could submit questions during our discussion in the question box, which we will address at the end of the event. While the information we share today may keep you up at night, we'd like to get you to a point where you can comfortably sleep. My name is Kevin Thomas. I'm the head of marketing for Integrated Cyber, and I'm focused on distilling the complex challenges business face while distilling a message that's customer focused and understandable. Thus, this webinar is the type of tool where we'll take the complexities of the insurance industry and provide you with enough knowledge to ask the right questions and understand how to protect your business and your livelihood. Joining me today is Pete Karolczak. Pete brings over 30 years of experience in IT services, software, and consulting, spanning both Fortune 10 global enterprises to early stage startups. Previously, Pete held senior executive positions at Hewlett Packard and as an SVP GM of their IT outsourcing. Pete was responsible for the global $15 billion IT outsourcing business, including managed security services, enterprise cloud, and mobility services. We're also joined by Kirsten Bay, who's the CEO and co-founder of Cysurance and brings over 25 years of experience in risk intelligence, information management, and policy expertise, including 7 years as CEO of big data and cybersecurity companies. She's been appointed to congressional committees, government agencies, and international organizations developing cyber policies, and is a great resource to provide that crossover between cybersecurity and insurance. Now that you know the voices and backgrounds of today's speakers, let's take a look at today's goals. Hands-on, what we're really looking for is that demystifying cyber insurance. I mean, we want to look at its role and importance and share some horror stories, talk about the jargon, as well as talk about examples of coverage, how you can protect yourself in order for you to sleep at night. Now, what we want you to walk away with, being that this is an educational webinar, is what to look for when you're looking at the marketplace and you're looking at cyber insurance and you're looking at your protection. And really, I think the number 2 bullet to me is the most important, which is what to ask. Now, what to ask both internally, what to ask to your leadership, what to ask for the people that work in your department, as well as what to ask externally. When you're going out and saying, you know what, maybe I do need protection. What should I be asking? What should I be looking for? And you're going into it with an educated mindset. And that really is kind of the key. And then finally, the third point is how to ensure that you are properly protected. So, what I want to do is hand it over to Pete, and he's going to kind of walk through why cyber insurance is so important. And then we'll kind of connect those dots as we move into both the cyber protection as well as cyber insurance. So Pete, why don't you go ahead and take it away?
Great, thank you, Kevin. First of all, let me start with a little bit of a preamble around traditional cyber defense. And then what I'll do is I'll segue into cyber insurance and pass it to the star of the show, Kirsten. Let me start by saying, I believe all companies, large and small, need some degree of cyber protection. The challenge for many is they don't necessarily know what they need. They may not be in a position to afford what they need. And sadly, I think to some degree, to be honest with you, there's a certain degree of wishful thinking that we've encountered, especially in less technical companies, that they could never be a target of such cyber attacks. Unfortunately, that is not the case, and we are in fact seeing an increased number of cyber incidents and attacks occurring specifically in small businesses. And that's part of our theme today. Now, with respect to the relationship between cyber defenses and cyber insurance, I'd like to offer a way to think about it using the metaphor of a perimeter defense. Let's start, as you have it, in the center of everything is your business, our business. At the end of the day, this is what we are trying to protect. On the outside, we have threats, bad actors, fishes, viruses, bots, you name it, all trying to hurt our business. And ideally, metaphorically, figuratively, and perhaps even literally, we would have 360 degrees of protection surrounding our business. Now, I recognize that's not always possible or practical, but let's talk about the defenses we feel are the most important. And then I'll, again, finish with how cyber insurance complements whatever we may have. So let's start with basic prevention. We always recommend this as a starting point. This is perhaps the minimum, and it's mandatory. The goal, simply put, let's make it harder for the bad things to happen. Starts with having a secure network, and whether you run your own or rely on a trusted partner, this is a necessary minimum investment all companies need to think about. And I would include basic care and feeding, such as, good user administration, good policy, passwords, etc. These are just mandatory. Beyond that, we always strongly recommend some form of endpoint protection, and preferably more than basic sort of consumer antivirus. Endpoints are by far the #1 attack vector, and deploying some form of endpoint protection we think is critical and actually quite affordable for even the smallest businesses. Next on our 360 journey, I'd probably say, addressing the fact that prevention is not good enough. We strongly recommend that even the smallest businesses have some form of, I'll call it threat or incident detection and response. This is important because no matter how well you are preventing, i.e., no matter how much you've invested in prevention solutions, the reality is there will always be something that gets through, or often actually let through by your own employees unintentionally. I recognize that most smaller companies, are not necessarily in a position to set up their own 24/7 security operations center, but that is where companies like Integrated Cyber can help. And while today is not about selling, my point is that there is some reactive response that's both necessary and actually quite affordable. Now, the last sections complete what we think is the mandatory or minimum 360-degree perimeter. And they tend to be mitigation or avoidance-centric solutions. They help assess and test and identify and proactively remediate risks and known vulnerabilities. I think we all agree it's always better to resolve things ahead of an incident, not in the panic thereafter. And there's a lot of capabilities from testing, from vulnerability monitoring, even good old-fashioned risk assessment engagements that small companies can both afford and get in front of the problems, at least understand how vulnerable they really are. But as we've talked about in previous webinars, we feel strongly that last circle, a proactive program that targets employees specifically, helping to reduce the risk that they generate, is actually one of the most important and reasonable investments that companies can make. And the reason is quite simple. 80% minimum of the incidents and threats of all size companies originate with our own employees and workers. And as we said, it's not malicious, it's unintentional in 99% of the cases, but they let things in. And the problem with employee-centric incidents is they are authenticated, authorized users in your network. They let them in, and by the nature of that beast, incidents that come directly and safely are already quite deep and quite dangerous. Now, this is the one investment that also reduces the number of incidents to begin with, as opposed to simply blocking them or preventing them. It is one of the best returns on investment a company can make. But again, it's all about the 360 coverage and balancing numerous investments to defend against potential threats. Now notice, and while it's only a graphic, and by the way, Kevin, a fantastic graphic, there are gaps in these capabilities, and graphically intentionally. This represents a reality that something can still get through even when companies invest in substantial defensive capabilities. And of course, if your company is unable to afford the full 360, then your, quote, gap in your perimeter is even greater and riskier. So let's segue to the topic of the day. What if we actually added additional protection in the form of cyber insurance, sort of the inner perimeter, just in case something does get through our outer perimeter? We think of cyber insurance as that inner last mile of defense that protects the company. And while I don't want to misconstrue this, it does not defend you from a virus, data theft, or ransomware. It does protect you. It protects your company from the often unrecoverable financial disaster that accompanies many such attacks. And in most cases, small businesses struggle to recover after such incidents. And we feel, for that reason, this last investment, this highly affordable, simple thing, is an absolute must. Again, it does not replace the necessary due diligence and defenses in cyber protection, but it is as important in protecting your company, which is what we're all about today. So, Kirsten, I realize I may have sounded perhaps a little melodramatic, but I do often hear from smaller companies that they just don't feel the risk is relevant to them, that they have perhaps antivirus installed and they're set, they're small, no one would ever notice them or target them. You've been in the cyber insurance world for a while, so would you mind sharing perhaps some stories with our listeners about the consequences you've experienced?
Yes, well, your points are exactly correct. And all anyone has to do is pick up a newspaper and recognize that cyber risks are becoming greater threats to everybody at every level every day. And so this particular use case here that you see about the ransomware attack against a Canadian retail chain is a really perfect example, is the point that you just made, Pete, which is, if you look at the losses on this slide, the $100,000 business interruption loss, which is a disappointment. That means that that company had $100,000 they didn't make that day or that moment because they weren't able to be up and running. But the more important figure is the one that sits above it, which is the $1 million in mitigation expenses, including investigation, remediation, customer notification. And so this is a very great illustration of what really can impact companies of any size, particularly small companies. Because what you see is that the remediation and the ancillary aspects of fixing a breach dwarf the initial loss of a particular event. And so these are the things that could be game changers or game ending events for small businesses in particular. But there are things that they think about not being particularly relevant because, who's going to wake up in the morning and decide that Kirsten's the person that's going to be picked on today? And what people need to understand is that the bad guys become very sophisticated and actually does most of this automated. It's the way that they get their ROI on their investment of attacking people, which is their ability to automate the attacks against others in range of IP addresses, of stolen bank accounts. However people decide that they're going to automate that attack vector, you're just a target of opportunity. And the initial loss can be dwarfed completely by what it takes to actually fix the problem. So if we take another example, and this is to the point that we were also making around phishing attacks. This is a particularly relevant discussion in today's environment because now you have most of your workforce distributed. So the opportunity for an attacker to leverage this particular vector to take down a company is pretty significant. So what often happens in these particular circumstances is usually it's an HR type function phishing email that would result in all of those people clicking on it, even though they just know that there could be potentially something wrong. But when you're being emailed about your 401k, your vacation pay, vacation time, insurance related, open enrollment. These are all things when you're not in your office now in particular, you're concerned about how things are going in your company, a note from the CEO, you're going to open it. And this is a particularly strong example of then what it takes, because then as Pete was alluding to, you're the gateway, and then they do what is called escalation of privileges. And once they're in, they continue to move up and up and up and up through that network to be able to exploit customer records, private information. So now you went from a loss to having to do claims around privacy breach, notifying customers, just because there was one simple entry point into that network that continues to grow exponentially in terms of its cost structure and the claims that would result from it that the insurance company would have to cover or you would have to cover. And then lastly, this particular, I mean, everyone worries about ransomware, I think, at some point or another, just because it is something that is so highly publicized. And I think also illustrates the fact that it's something that people can really understand because the losses are significant and people all over have been impacted by the results of such things, like whether people couldn't close mortgages because their cities were impacted. People have experienced real and physical pain from ransomware events occurring. But this one in particular, the Are You OK, is one that is important because this is a highly sophisticated reconnaissance type ransomware event that leverages high cost ransoms. But the way that they start this process is they start to look at the company itself. They actually root inside the organization, look at the behavior and communications of the organization, and make a determination of the best way to leverage and lock down the system. It's also important to know that this particular type of ransomware can happen through phishing emails. So, people might say, not a problem for me. We have a super great system running. There's no way, because our people are also really well trained. But pop-ups on websites are also a very strong way that this particular ransomware gets through to people's networks. And so just remember that it's not just things like phishing emails, that there are many areas of vulnerabilities all through these different types of systems that could result in both smaller, like what we like to call sort of smash and grab type ransomware. The second you click on that email, it locks you down. And then there are others where they're going to perpetrate invoice fraud. They're going to send fake invoices to customers. They're going to change passwords. They're going to leverage all aspects of your network. And then when they've bled you dry, then they're going to lock your system down. So that's a particularly scary thing, I know, but it's just important to recognize that there's this significant breadth and depth of how people can be compromised and how impactful, both from a financial perspective to a downstream network availability perspective, that can keep people down for days and months. So I think that's enough scariness for now.
Yeah, thank you, Kirsten. You know what? You've convinced me I should look into some kind of insurance coverage. Pete talks about the gaps and the holes. You talk about how they are going to get in. But for me, I mean, the jargon's confusing enough on the cyber side. But then you throw in the insurance jargons and the terms, and I'm lost. Right, and it's complicated enough. I know there's hundreds of options on the one side that we tend to focus on in cybersecurity, but you lose me when you get into insurance. So what I've done is I've pulled a bunch of insurance terms. I want to throw them out and one at a time, and would love to learn what they mean and kind of what I should be looking for. And I know I'm not alone. And for the people on this call, pull out your pen and paper, make sure you take some notes. Like I said earlier, this is going to be rebroadcast, so you can listen to it again. So I want to run through about 9 different concepts to get some quick answers from you. Does that work?
Absolutely.
Okay. So, hey, let's start with first party versus third party coverage. What's that mean?
Well, I like to use the car crash analogy here, which also dovetails nicely back to employees are the perpetrators very often of attacks because you can't get in a car crash unless you're driving a car. So that's a good analogy here for first party is your car, right? Your company, your network, your losses. That's what has to be fixed, remediated, covered, and replenished. Business interruption as an example. Anything that impacts you directly is first party coverage. Third party coverage is the other person's car, and if they were injured, the potential lawsuit that comes from that. So third party coverages are really what are the liability coverages that extend out to protect you from potential lawsuits, notification costs, potential lawsuits from customers who might sue you because of that, reputational harm and damage. So it really is the connection between all the elements that have to be put in place to protect your own company from those losses, and then the liability aspects that come from the other parties being impacted or damaged from that event as well. Does that make sense?
I think it does. Cyber crime. Now, when I bought insurance, I thought I was covered. To expand on this whole term of being covered for cyber crime versus cyber insurance, how is it all kind of related?
I think this is probably one of the most confusing elements of cyber insurance that exists. So it's important to know, and for everyone who has a policy or thinks that they have a policy, go get it out and look at it, because this is what gets added into a standard cyber liability insurance policy. They're rarely just part of the policy. And so they're also, so I'm going to throw out a term that you won't have in here, but it's a sublimit, which means that if you bought $1 million worth of coverage, the coverage you have for cybercrime is going to be a different number and a lesser number. But what that covers is, the inevitable, hey, Mr. CFO, send a wire of $50,000, and they send it when they know somebody else is out. So that wire fraud, social engineering type of events, invoice fraud's another one. Things that are not really perpetrated through a full compromise, but actually through convincing someone to do something else that you wouldn't ordinarily do. But these are different coverages on your policy. And because of the nature of confusion around this, it's also important to note that very often normal crime coverage that people have in general liability, it might be covered there too. So not to confuse even more, but it's important to make sure that you're checking both sides of those elements of your policies, because you might have double coverage or no coverage at all.
That's interesting. And that goes back to my point, know what to ask.
Mm-hmm.
know what to look for, what you've got within your organization. I've seen media liability. What does that actually mean?
Well, this is something I think is very interesting about cyber liability policies, because there's been such an evolution of how people use technology to run their businesses that I think it's actually more important to think about your cyber liability policy as your digital insurance policy. So you have your general liability policy to protect all of the bricks and mortar and physical assets that you have in an organization. And this relates to your digital footprint. What's really interesting about it is this relates to things like copyright infringement, that's a digital copyright infringement, plagiarism, product disparagement. So anything that is related to your products and how it's represented digitally, you have actually protections for. So if someone were to sue you for trademark infringement because they think that your trademark on your website is infringing upon theirs or some likelihood of confusion, your cyber liability policy will actually cover that. So when you see on an application or an attestation form, have you had an attorney review your website and trademarks? The reason why this question is being asked is for this purpose, because they're actually covering you for the liability if someone sues you for the digital content you have.
Interesting. Protected information. What does that mean?
Well, this is anything that we refer to as personally identifiable information. So this is either your own company's, your own employees' information, or your customers' names, birth dates, addresses, credit card information, driver's licenses. all of those types of things that relate to a person's identity, that's protected information. So if it's lost, then that's where a lot of these fines start to happen. And also when you have triggers for breach notification to your customer base.
Is that where we've seen the large suits that government agencies will bring against companies for the loss of or the exposure of their clients' information?
Exactly, and that's really where the genesis of even the GDPR rules started to come from, because it's not just even about losing it, it's also about how much are you using my information to either target me for advertising or other more ancillary type elements to that digital footprint. So it's important to remember again that there are privacy laws that protect people for just the dissemination of information, both intentional or unintentional, as well as then the malicious distribution, dark web kind of things that people usually think about when they think of protected information.
So if I got fined, so if I had a breach and my customer data was released and then I got fined, my insurance, proper insurance, would cover the fines or a portion of the fines based on my coverage in
Yes,
the event that the government did come after me?
Yes, they would. It would be covered. The fines would be covered, as well as notification cost to customers, lawsuits resulting from that. So all of those, that circle would be drawn around it from a coverage perspective.
Cool. How's that fit into social engineering?
Well, again, that tucks underneath, and so it's good. It's under the cybercrime grouping. Again, this is an area that is considered separate and apart from what is traditional in the cyber liability program. And that really is the attempt to get someone to do something that by impersonating someone else. So like, I have, and many people have received, emails from a CFO saying, hey, I'm going to send that wire. And it's like, I didn't tell you to send that wire. So those are the things that are or even admins, convincing admins to change passwords because they think it's you asking them. So social engineering is one of the most more sophisticated ways that people are convinced to do things that if you walked up to them on the street, they absolutely wouldn't do, right? But they're very good at impersonating people, and that's really one of the dangers of our cyber realm, as we know, is being anonymous. You can take on any personality that you want to.
So once again, if I have the breach because of that method of getting access, then and I've got coverage, then I'm covered for the losses that if that's the way the breach occurred.
That's correct.
Okay. Acronym soup, PCI,
Yes.
CCPA, and NY Shield. We've got one full word in there. So what's the difference and what do these three stand for and what do I need the coverage for?
Yes, well, ironically, SHIELD is actually an acronym as well.
You got me there.
But at least it seems like a word.
Yes.
So these, of course, are all regulations or laws. And it's important, like even HIPAA as an example, that we try to point out to people for the protection of healthcare records. That is an absolute law versus a regulation, which the difference being that if you break a law, the consequences can be much more dire. But these are all regulatory situations where CCPA is California's Privacy Protection Act. What's interesting about that is it's probably our closest cousin to the GDPR rule in Europe, which really starts to protect people from the sharing of identity information and in addition to the loss of it. Another really important thing to keep in mind here, and this goes back to the small business customer in particular, is that prior to this, there are lots of privacy breach rules out there for notification requirements, but this one has a minimum damage per record allocated to it, which means that you're not going to leave that courtroom with 0 fines. So if you're a small doctor's office and you have 5,000 records and they determine that the damage is $300 a record, you can do the math. So cyber insurance policies are designed to help support and cover these losses as well. PCI is related to the payment card systems. And again, that's a very strict regulation to ensure credit card data is kept safe. And the fines can be very steep. And New York Shield is just a new one for people who are in New York, but even if you're a Delaware company and you have one customer who has a New York address, then you are subject to the New York Shield regulation as well. And what's interesting with that is you don't actually have to suffer a cybercrime or a loss. If you are audited and found to be out of compliance without any event occurring, you can be fined. So they're becoming greater and greater in terms of their reach and also the consequences.
Wow. Yeah, you talk about the gaps in that 360 coverage. There's stuff that I think that doesn't fall into the natural attack that we think of from a cyber perspective. So contingent business interruption and extra expense. I suppose that's when something does happen. This is the coverage to keep my doors open, my lights on.
Yes, and actually there are two categories. There's business interruption and contingent business interruption to start. So business interruption really it's the first party coverage. It's what you have sustained as a loss for your business being down. And that can be a variety of reasons. It doesn't even have to be malicious. It can be that there was an extended power outage, or your payment card system went down because a provider went down for an extended period of time. So it's important to remember that these policies now are designed to be risk management tools as much as tools to remediate against malicious events. And so there are ways now to recover business losses if something like some normal type of event occurs as well. So it's important to think about that when you're looking at what potential coverages you have in the world. The contingent business interruption piece is your third party coverage, which means anyone outside of your realm who is impacted downstream and isn't able to conduct their business because you had an outage. And a lot of policies now have both, so that not only are you covered, but your customers or your partners are covered, which is particularly important for people who have mandates and contracts around cyber events. Having a contingent business interruption clause is extremely important because you could be liable for those fees if you don't have that in your coverage.
Now, is this just from a cyber interruption, or does an event like the wildfires that we've seen in California where I'm located, and or the whole COVID-19 shutdown, does it cover even things like that?
Well, for something like the wildfires, yes, and not all policies do. So this is something to make sure one pays attention to. For things that are not related to infrastructure not functioning, because that's really the purpose of it. If you go back to this thought of ensuring and protecting your digital footprint, when something like the power being down, phone systems being down, when those elements are taken out of your digital footprint, you can no longer conduct business. So obviously the business interruption related to pandemics, there is actually pandemic insurance. Many people just don't have it. I think they'll see a surge in that particular coverage realm in the future. But in terms of how things are impacted, network outages and so on, it's actually pretty amazing when you look at the laundry list of different elements that stitch together that digital footprint that are covered to be able to mitigate for those particular losses.
No, excellent, great to know. Ransomware, obviously you've talked about this. Can you expand a little bit here?
Mm-hmm. So again, this is a really important topic, not only because it is such a high risk area for a lot of companies and something that is indiscriminate in how one could be impacted. It's also important to note that some policies will cover you to the full aggregate limit of the event. So what does that mean? It means that if you buy $1 million policy, you have $1 million of coverage for that. There are many policies that for ransomware, because of the nature of the risk, will sublimit it. So they'll say, you have $1 million policy, but if you get hit with ransomware, we're only going to cover you up to $100,000. Those policies are a lot less expensive, but I wouldn't want to make that gamble, because in an effect, you might be talking about a policy that goes from $1,000 to $1,800, which, feels kind of like a lot. But when we discuss, and you can see the financial impacts, that investment, I think, is a worthy investment. So when people are looking at the coverages that they see in their, whatever they're looking at, or comparing different coverages, my strong recommendation is always, always, always try to get the full coverage for ransomware, because it really is it's one of the more high probability events that you could be impacted by, and they're expensive.
Yeah, excellent. And the 9th box, can you talk about endorsements?
Yes, it's actually one of my favorite insurance words, because it means you're getting more. So endorsements are really nice features, because what they do is they essentially take away particular exclusions in your insurance policy, which is something that, you know, people, especially as it relates to cyber insurance, think that there are more exclusions than inclusions. So endorsements do, and typically it adds to the cost of the policy a little bit, but it gives you the opportunity to remove any of those exclusions and have broader coverages inside your program that just continues to extend what you're able to do. Like, for example, the when I mentioned the non-malicious outage, that's typically an endorsement on a policy, where most cyber liability policies will only cover you for a malicious event, and the non-malicious coverages will be an endorsement where it removes the exclusion that if something bad happens just because it happened, doesn't mean it's excluded from your coverage.
Interesting. Thank you. Now we've got a good baseline, and to me, the picture is apropos, because it's like we're coming out of the dark and riding our bike into the light, that we've got some basic understanding around the concepts. So now that we've got those baselines, talk to us a little bit about Cysurance and kind of what you guys do and what coverage options are, so people get an understanding of how they can protect their business.
Great, yes. Well, one thing that we have done is to create a cyber insurance program for small, medium-sized business, growing businesses, to reduce and attempt to reduce the complexity of everything that we just talked about, because it is really confusing. And, you know, but like the first time I think anyone buys car insurance, it's a little bit confusing too. And then you add on all these other complexities and it's daunting. But one thing that we tried to do was create standardized cyber insurance programs for people with the most comprehensive coverage that we could find, to make it affordable, make it simple, no applications, no underwriting, just go and enroll, have a nice day. But we also learned that there's not a one-size-fits-all approach. So we've created a tiered strategy to our product suite to be able to manage the different needs that people might have, both from a cost perspective and a coverage perspective, so that, for example, in our standalone, our policy, it's a really great policy, but it's complex. It has multiple limits. I don't know what limit I need. It has multiple limits for cybercrime coverage. It has a low deductible, but it has all these different features. And while we're very proud of that product, and it has a lot of features around, like, for example, the non-malicious outages and extensive third-party and first-party coverages, not everyone needs that type of product. So we also introduced our flat fee program, which is something that can be rolled out across a whole set of customers. We partner a lot with people who want just a standard flat form. It's, you know, a low-cost product, can be monthly. It covers all of the same things our full standalone product does without cybercrime. So it's a good entry-level product. You know, it's like $38 a month. It's one of those why wouldn't you kind of things, but it gives you all the same types of coverages that you would need to feel comfortable with lower limits. And then lastly, we have our Ransom Protect program, which is a service warranty reimbursement program specifically around ransomware products, to just give assurance that if there is an event, a small event, that there are funds there available to get immediate recovery and get back and running. And a lot of our partners like to integrate that product just as a way to give their customers some comfort, and they can utilize that product for a variety, for remediation, for other expenses that need to be covered. And then if need be, they can trigger their larger cyber insurance policy, but sometimes it's not necessary. So we really wanted to create flexibility for people and some element of simplicity. And then for people who want a much larger limit and want a different set of parameters in that cyber insurance program, then we can put them into our full standalone product, which gives them many, many, many options.
Can you expand a little bit? I know with the standalone and flat fee that you guys are, if I'm correct, you're regulated by the insurance industry. And why, can you explain that a little bit and why that's important?
Yes, so we are a 50-state agency, and Chubb is our underwriter. So we have very strong balance sheet backing, as they say, to be able to cover our constituent insureds. And so what that allows us to do is on our platform, we can enroll customers in partnership with our partners. So it removes the element of everyone having to be a licensed broker, because one cannot represent insurance without being a licensed broker. So our platform that we created allows people to enroll for those programs on a licensed site so that they can then roll that out to their customer base and easily be now rolling either the flat fee program out or the standalone with very low friction in terms of bringing someone online and having them be covered.
Excellent, thank you. Appreciate you walking through the terms as well as through the coverage options that you guys offer, and hopefully those, as we stitch those pieces together, that it kind of makes more sense to the folks that are on the call.
Yes.
So thank you. I'm going to toss it back to Pete to kind of walk us through a summary, and then we'll get into some questions and answers.
Great. So firstly, thank you, Kirsten. That was quite amazing. And as always, I learned something new from you every time we talk. So let's wrap up. I want to leave some room for questions. And but if I had to summarize as I was listening, what I learned today, it's this. Firstly, I think that having some level of cyber insurance does feel like a no-brainer. While at the same time, it's not a replacement for fundamental cyber protection. It's not a panacea. It will not stop an attack, and yet it is equally important as last mile of protection for your company in general. Second thing I took away, yes, those stories were quite horrific, but I think Kirsten made it very clear that there are consequences, and it's less about risk reward and more about risk versus consequence. Especially for smaller businesses, you know, this is ultimately a minor investment in insurance. Just knowing that even when something terrible happens, your business can recover, it can survive. And I think you made it very clear that there are consequences that stretch far beyond what I'll call IT inconveniences, including even third-party consequences that can become extremely expensive. And it's clear why so many small businesses, I think, are unable to recover from even a single event. Now, on a positive note, I think we would all agree that insurance seems a little less confusing after that fantastic lesson. Though it's also clear having a trusted partner to help in your corner to help sort of navigate this very important area, find the right coverage is equally valuable. I think you did a great job of hopefully making it clear that cyber insurance is in fact really affordable, especially compared to the cost of an incident. And I would say it's also worth talking a little bit about the relationship between defensive investments and cyber insurance payouts. This, by the way, reaffirms, you know, the need to think about cyber insurance as complementary to cyber defenses. And if my company were to ever have a critical incident, I would want to have that insurance claim settled as quickly as possible. I'd want as many of those endorsements as you explained. I'd want clear and demonstrable evidence of due diligence to maximize my coverage. I'd want to make it as seamless as possible. And that is, by the way, why integrated cyber, which offers cyber defenses, and Cysurance work so closely together. We have pre-integrated all of our cyber capabilities, all of that information with the Cysurance engine so that critical claims can in fact be almost immediately processed, right? That all the claims required information of our joint customers is immediately available for insurers for rapid payout. So is cyber insurance a no-brainer? I think the answer is yes. And between Cysurance and integrated cyber, we are happy to help you find that right coverage for your business. And with that, let me once again thank Kirsten Bay of Cysurance. Thank you, Kirsten. And Kevin of Integrated Cyber, great job. I loved the back and forth in the quiz show. And let's pass it back to any questions that our audience may have submitted.
Excellent. Thank you, Pete. All right. So there's still time. If you want to submit another question, you can use the question and answer window on your Zoom screen. So first question, this is for you, Kirsten, which is, I'm an MSP, a managed service provider. Should I have coverage?
100% yes. I often see many MSPs who don't have coverage, and it's important to understand that there are two elements of risk for a managed service provider not having coverage. One is just the cyber liability aspect of it, and the other is the error and omissions side of it, which is the heightened portion of the liability side. And this, a lot of people are aware of RMM tools being compromised, where the remote management tools are compromised through some means, and ransomware has been distributed to every customer of an MSP. Those are the instances where having tech E&O coverage is super essential, because it protects you from that catastrophic risk of having to fix problems, pay your customers back their losses, pay for their downtime, and also any particular impacts that might come from lawsuits from those events. So it is very essential that MSPs have coverage, because their liability is particularly high in that respect.
Excellent, thank you. Pete, question for you. The question is, I'm a small business and I want to know if I really need coverage all the way around that circle graphic that you showed earlier in the presentation.
All right. Yep, that's a good question. So firstly, I recognize that affordability is a major issue. I think that's very valid, and especially in this market, for many small businesses struggling to stay alive, asking the same question. So let me maybe offer a few things that might help at least our clients, our prospects, other small businesses make a good decision. So first of all, some prevention on both the network, on endpoints, basic, as I said, block and tackling, I consider that mandatory. I really do. It's not expensive. It's not hard. It is just basic prevention, and not having that is just asking for trouble, as it becomes too easy for attackers to get inside. And remember, as Kirsten said, attackers are no longer kids in basements who have heard of your company URL. They're bots, they're automatons, they're trolling the network for known vulnerabilities. Nobody is safe, and in fact, the smaller businesses have been a really lucrative target. Now, we do recommend some detection and response, especially in some industries where there's a lot at stake. And, because again, things still do happen. And when something happens, you want it, discovered as quickly as humanly possible, preferably by a machine, which is a lot faster than a human, and most importantly, remediated or solved as quickly as possible. In the case of ransomware, good technology that, first of all, prevents most of them, can also detect it, quarantine it, take that endpoint off the network, and immediately remove it before it spreads, right? That technology is worthwhile, because that is really an added protection. And as Kirsten said, a lot of things come in, not even through closed doors, they come in through our employees and open doors. They are still our number one vulnerability, and they come in through our own network on our company issued laptops. Now, if I were to say those are two, I would say the minimum. If you have the ability to extend beyond those two things, I would personally suggest something in the area of employee awareness, employee-centric vulnerability, behavioral analytics. We offer a very compelling service that is one of our most popular, and it's one of the most popular because it's one of the most incredible in terms of ROI, right? It really makes a difference, and simply stated, it's the only investment that actually reduces the number of incidents. Everything else blocks and prevents. This actually reduces it. And as Kirsten talked about, if you fall victim to some of this very clever social networking, that's your fault. That's not the bad guy's fault. And awareness and employee training in that is so important and so affordable. So I would say those three combined, the last investments in vulnerability monitoring, general risk management, I would say probably fall in to the category of critical, depending on your industry, depending on what kind of infrastructure you have. And in all cases, I would say have that in a ring. I believe business cyber insurance is an absolute must.
Excellent. Thanks, Pete. Hey, question for you, Kirsten. It says, I've read articles that cyber events are not covered because everything's true on the internet, right? Is a cyber attack really going to be covered and paid out?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is a great question, and it speaks really to what Pete just said. One of the things, as an aside, that I find interesting and have had since I've worked in cyber is that somehow the risk management function and the technology function have a tendency to get broken apart, and having them be together is what's going to get you coverage. And so there are two elements of why, or two significant ones of why we see these things not covered. The biggest one is the cybercrime wire fraud coverage piece, which people are constantly in lawsuits about. And I was reading one not long ago where this company lost $4 million in a wire transfer fraud scheme, and they sued their insurance company saying that the language in the policy was ambiguous, and it wasn't. And the judge said, I've actually never seen more unambiguous language, so go away. Like, I don't even know why you're suing anybody. So make sure you're covered. And it's very clear that they weren't covered. And so that's number one, is just being covered for certain types of events. And the wire fraud social engineering component is the biggest gotcha that people have. But then the other side of it is things like nation state attacks or fraud and misrepresentation. But generally speaking, I mean, most, especially with Chubb, I can speak to Chubb, that they work very hard to get coverage. And so like they added in the terrorism endorsement, cyber terrorism endorsement, to try to cover around this concern that nation state attacks might have downstream impact on smaller organizations, like with some of the big attacks we had, where when there were broad investigations, it seemed like there was a nation state attacker, which would result in everyone getting a decline. So those are very rare, few and far between, and mostly it's either you absolutely misrepresented what you said you had, didn't have, and when they investigated, they found that to be true, or you just didn't have the coverage to begin with.
Yeah, and maybe you didn't know what to ask for when you were getting the coverage or what to look for. Back to our earlier points. Right. Question for both of you, which is what area of attack and coverage are you seeing the most in today's landscape? We'll start with you, Kirsten.
Well, ransomware obviously is the big one, and I have seen a lot of information about losses escalating, especially in the last 90 days around ransomware, particularly through phishing attacks with this distributed workforce. So I've seen a lot of claim activity accelerating through this period of time that has been very impactful.
Yeah, and the ransomware is interesting as a marketer, and we look at product and pricing and demand generation and staying in business. I have found it really interesting that the folks that are pushing the ransoms are very smart on the amounts that they ask for, that it's painful enough, but enough in a product sense that they actually get paid and then can kind of stay in business and continue to move forward. Whereas they're not asking for $10 million, they're asking for 30,000 or 50,000, knowing that they're going to get the money, and that it seems to be very product priced from a market perspective that you wouldn't normally think of in a ransom world. And they're giving the keys, and most folks can decrypt their data or get their data back once the ransom. Is that what you've seen as well?
Yes, they even have help desks. Call 1-800 bad guy and we'll help you walk through decrypting your data. I mean, it's really fascinating, and you're right. I mean, it's turned into an industry, and you can even do ransomware as a service. You're like, I'm not very sophisticated at this. I'm going to go hire someone to do it for me, and I'll do like a revenue share. And so it's really astonishing how, as Pete said, the automation of being able to do so much of this has resulted in this cottage industry, I guess we'll call it.
Well, Pete, anything you want to add?
No, I mean, I think ransomware is a big one. As we've said time and time again, it's employee-centric attacks, right? And I will say we've all gotten the uncle with the gold mine letter and with funny misspellings that you share as almost as a joke. The reality is some of these are getting very sophisticated. And recently it occurs to me, more and more, ironically, as a means of securing our data, we are sharing links, right? We're sharing URLs to Box and Dropbox and these other and Teams and SharePoint. And we're almost getting immune to, of course, you're going to click on a link because we want to be secure. I'm not going to share a file. Guess what? A clever link just came on, a message it looked like from my CEO. I'm busy, I'm tired. It's relevant to the topic that we've been exchanging. I click on it, right? So the reality is these employee-centric, I am authenticated, authorized in the network, accessing some very critical data. And I'm also relatively savvy, and I clicked on a link. And that is probably our biggest exposure right now.
Well, okay, we got 4 minutes. I got 3 quick questions. I'll get through them fast. So Kirsten, when my business gets hit, and if I've got coverage, how quickly are insurance payments generally made?
Well, as I like to say in insurance, the answer is always, it depends. But if one has a good monitoring system, a good log collection system, all the things that Pete talked about, they can be made very quickly. And there are instances where there will be an advance payment made to deal with immediate concerns, much like if you had a fire in your house, you would get some immediate remuneration just to get back up and running. But typically it's within a few days. I've heard some that have lasted several months. So I would say that the most important factor is ensuring that you have the technology capability to at least have some log detection and ability to identify where the entrance point was, the ingress, so that you can help supply as much information to the insurance company as possible. That's really where it's going to make the biggest difference.
Excellent. Thanks. Pete, what should I do if I get hit with a ransomware virus?
Don't do anything until you talk to a professional, would be my first advice, right? Believe it or not, from experts in ransomware, experts in remediation, can actually do much more than many companies realize is even possible. I'm not saying that they can solve it, but they can most certainly try. And for most companies out there, the first thing they should do is ask for help, call us, call whoever their trusted partner is, but get help. And there's a lot that we can do to minimize potential damage.
Excellent. Final question. Kirsten, should I pay or should my business pay ransoms?
Well, hopefully not. And if there are the proper backup systems running, then you may not have to. If the machine has been infected by a certain type of malware ransom that bricks a machine, no. So to Pete's point, the most important thing, like if you have cyber insurance, is the breach coach. They help identify what and how, and then also to get privilege. Very important, the privilege piece to ensure that you have private communication between you and your professionals. So hopefully not, but if push comes to shove, then your insurance company will help you pay that ransom and get back up and running.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Pete. Thank you, Kirsten, for joining us today. Hopefully this was, valuable for folks, that you walk away more educated now than you did an hour ago, whether it's live or whether you're listening to the rebroadcast. Reach out to us, reach out to our team, reach out to me, to Pete, to Integrated Cyber. We have Cysurance as our partner in this realm. At the end of the day, like I said at the beginning, we want to make it so that you can sleep comfortably at night, knowing that your business is protected, not if, but when something does happen within your organization. So thank you all. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.